Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Preemie Chats. My name is Leah Whitehead, and I am a preemie mom and a volunteer with the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation. The Canadian Premature Babies Foundation is also known as CPBF, and it is a charitable organization. Its mission is to support and educate Canadian families of premature babies. This Preemie Chat series is just one of the many ways that CPBF supports families and shares information with families and healthcare professionals. Here, every Friday, we talk with medical professionals, researchers, and the experts, parents who share with us their NICU experience and knowledge. And we want you to be part of the discussion too. So please leave us a comment and let us know that you're watching. And when we get into our discussion, please interact with us by sending in your questions as well. You'll also want to check out CPBF's website. It's there on the screen. It's canadianpreemies.org. And there you'll find all kinds of resources and support. Parents are the most important people and intervention a baby can have in NICU. But NICU itself can be disorienting, to say the least. On this website, you'll find resources like the new video series, Welcome to the NICU, that'll hopefully make you feel like you just know a little bit more about this maybe new environment that you're in. And right now, in the face of the fears and anxiety that's been brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, CPBF has put together the Parent Care Program, and they offer 4 therapy sessions for families currently in NICU or those who have been discharged up to 3 years. To apply for the Parent Care Program and to watch the videos, please visit the CPBF website, canadianpreemies.org. Our topic today is one that for so many years has not been talked about, so much so that many people thought they were alone in their journey of grief and loss. In our pregnancy, birthing, and NICU journeys, many go through seasons of depression, anxiety, feeling alone and isolated, and needing support. Maureen Lim is one mother who has come to terms with her own personal story. And she says it's time to talk about the truth and the struggle to overcome grief, sadness, and disappointments in our lives. It is a privilege for me today to introduce this amazing woman. Maureen is the mama of a 27-weeker. She is the home educator of her 2 boys, professional educator, and encourager. She's a former member of the Canadian team representing Canada in track and field, and now enjoys taking afternoon walks. Once a competitive Latin ballroom dancer, you can find her salsa dancing with her husband and playing with her kids, believing that they are infinite gifts each day to be thankful for. And that doesn't even cover it all. Maureen authored her family's story in her new book entitled Own Your Story. I had the honor of reading it, and it is so beautifully honest. And so I'm very much looking forward to our discussion here today with Maureen, and it will be the question and answer format. So I hope that you will interact and ask questions, and that you will join me in welcoming Maureen today. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. That was a wonderful introduction, Leah. I am just honored, and what a privilege to have this discussion with all of our listeners. I am so excited to get this discussion going.
So I wanted to start by just asking you, for those who are unfamiliar with your book, to share kind of a brief overview of what's included.
Yes, so as you mentioned, this is my first self-published book, and it documents the journey of grief after a stillbirth. So I had a stillbirth at 26 and a half weeks. And I knew quite early on that I needed support, that I needed help in guiding my grief process. I had a subsequent pregnancy that went to term, But even then, I was still wrestling with anger, disappointment, depression, all of the emotions that come along with grief and loss. And after that pregnancy, I had two pregnancy losses, I had two miscarriages. And again, having to revisit some of those raw feelings of grief came up. And I knew that I had to heal because very shortly after I had a premature birth at 27 weeks, as you mentioned. And with all of that, I I felt very isolated. I felt very alone. And so the reason I wrote that book was because I didn't find that there was a book that was speaking to my lived experience. And so I felt that there were others who were going through similar experiences. And so I wanted to recount what had happened and how I could participate in helping others to heal as well.
Would a book like this have helped you in your journey?
That's a great question. Um, I do believe that a book like the one that I wrote would have helped because I would have not felt as isolated, not felt as alone. A lot of my friends and colleagues who had pregnancies didn't have a stillbirth or didn't have a premature birth. So I didn't feel like they could necessarily relate to some of the feelings that I had of isolation and feeling very alone. I didn't have a community or a group that I could necessarily go to. So having a book really can highlight some of the challenges and what to expect, and to know that I wasn't alone.
What allowed you to share this story now? It's been a number of years since your journey began, and now you're in kind of a different stage of life. Your preemie is in school age now. So what allowed it? Why was the timing now to share it?
I believe that it was important for me to come to terms with a lot of those emotions because what happens, I think a lot of us who've experienced grief, we bury the grief, we bypass the grief, we circumvent it, we find ways to not deal with the grief. Life gets busy, and so I felt that I needed to have some distance between the events that happened and where I was, uh, where I could be in a place or a space to be able to write the truth of what I was feeling. And it helped me to further heal in those places where I thought that I had healed. And so I needed to write in order to be authentic and real with the parts of me that still were unhealed.
Hmm. What did help look like for you to bring you to the point of being able to write a book? Because like you said, most of us will bury that grief, right? And so why was yours exposed, or why did you feel like you could bring it to the surface?
I think part of the reason is that a book is something tangible. A book is something that you can hold. And so I felt like it was necessary for me to document it in a way that was physical, where I could see it and I can have my children also be in a place at one point, at some point, reading the accounts of what happened. And also for my husband, for us to have our history on paper, it also verifies it. It also makes our story real in our hearts, but also for other people to participate in it, so that each exchange that we had meant that it was real not only for us but for someone else who was also going through something similar. So I felt it was really important to have something physical as a way of highlighting our story.
Your kids, both of them are under 10, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, and so at what point, I think this is something that even preemie parents ask themselves who haven't experienced loss, but how much of the journey do they know? At what point do you share that with them? Do your boys know about your journey at this point, or is that something, how much do they know about what you and Joseph experienced?
That is a great question because I really struggle with that. Because, for example, my oldest is or was born a year to the date of our stillbirth. And so for me, it's when joy marries sorrow. And so to be able to also celebrate uh, my son's birthday, but also having a broken heart, knowing that my son would have been such and such an age. I haven't shared with him um, the details of the stillbirth because for me, it is something that I think will, as a family, we would want to share when he's a little bit older because I don't want him to feel um, those emotions of sadness on a day that should be joyful for him. In
Mm.
terms of my preemie birth with my son, my youngest, he does know that he is a warrior, he's a fighter, and he knows all of the details of his birth because I feel that it is something that is so important for preemie parents to share the strength of our children because they also demonstrate strength to others just by being here and being present and living fully. So I really think it's important that they understand the miraculous birth and how far they've come, and to participate in that. So and to share those victories with them and those milestones, I think are really really important.
What have you learned from your boys through all this? Because I mean, what you're saying about victory and their strength, and as a mother, I feel like we learn so much from our kids almost accidentally. And so what kind of things have they taught you through this experience?
The list is endless, really. I think for each of them, because of their personalities being so different, they have taught me different things. For example, my youngest, as I mentioned, he is so strong, but not only physically, but emotionally. He is compassionate. His heart is to love big, to love large. He sees no barriers when it comes to love, and it's just such an important aspect of who he is that it also penetrates other people's heart and their experience. I mean, you can't meet him without feeling his love, and so that is one of many things that I think he has taught me. And my oldest is to just live life full throttle. Just to he is extremely energetic. He has such wisdom for his age. He's very clever, and just to keep learning. He has such a knack for learning, and so yeah, I believe that they each teach us things about ourselves, that things that we may need to work on, or things that we have left aside that we might want to revisit, or just to be reminded of. And so I believe children are really good at that.
You mentioned a part in your book that, and in your story, but I read it in your book that gave me goosebumps. And that is that your son was born on the day that your other son also was born, who passed away. And you talked about joy and sorrow being together. How do we carry that as people? Both, I think oftentimes people feel like it's one or the other, or, you're either going through a good time or you're going through a bad time. But you really highlighted this in the book of carrying both emotions, both experiences. How does that happen?
Well, what's interesting, I think, is that grief definitely is part of my story, but it doesn't define who I am. And so I think what's important is that although grief is a part of my story, that I had to also look for specific reasons to be joyful. I had a subsequent healthy birth after my loss. That is reason to be joyful. That is reason to give thanks. There's so much about um, that being true for my story that I needed to accept the past, but to also move forward because there was so much life still yet to live and to be in a place where I could accept my past, but not be defined by my past. So, yes, the two, grief and joy, had to be in unison because for most people, there are experiences that are traumatic, and yet there are experiences that we could be grateful for and to be thankful for. Um, I think sometimes we could be in a place where we just live in that grief, and that could be detrimental for our future. It could be detrimental for the relationships that we have. It could be a stumbling block for having an intimate relationship or any kind of relationship, for that matter. And so I needed to be in a place where it wouldn't impact my relationship with my son and with my husband, and other relationships that I found important. So I needed to be in a position of healing, understanding these opposite emotions and being able to be okay with it.
I love that you're talking about really being vulnerable, like, because that is what it is, opening your heart to someone else and not allowing it to be closed. And so you mentioned the relationship with your son and you mentioned the relationship with your husband. And I'm wondering along the way, I mean, these kind of experiences are a major strain on couple relationships. And so, how did you and your husband go through it together?
Yeah, again, what a great question, because oftentimes, as we know, it could put a huge strain on marriages or relationships. For my husband and I, we made a concerted effort to see each other at the end of the day. So for him, it was the end of the workday. For me, it was the end of visiting with my son who was in the NICU. And we came together, we would have dinner together, we would go over our day together. It was an opportunity to remember the marriage in which our son was birthed. And so it was very important for us to put that as a priority. I also think it's important, um, for open communication with your partner, with your husband or wife, because these are the things that will help to sustain us through the challenges and overcoming some of the difficulties of having your baby in the NICU. So communication, coming back together at the end of the day were two important things that I found, really helped us to navigate a very difficult, traumatic time, for my husband and I. It was also important to ask for help. Some preemie parents are not in the position to ask for help in terms of having, relatives come and visit. But if you are in that position, I would highly recommend that you just ask. I know it's difficult. It's difficult for me to ask But at the end of it, you have to be in a place where you can then focus your energy, your time on your child, your baby who is in the NICU. So if you're able to ask for help, you can care better for yourself. And so those are the three things that I would highly encourage parents to do.
It's such a hard lesson to learn. And I know it is such an intimate journey that it can be difficult to invite people in to help because of their a lack of understanding, I'll say, just because I think if you haven't been through something like this, it can be hard to empathize and on a level that is real and authentic. And so you talk about that a little bit in your book, just in that other people interacting with you throughout your journey. And how did you move beyond that in terms of restoring relationships, keeping relationships that maybe were hurt or damaged during this time?
Yeah. For us, like you mentioned, unless you are a preemie parent, it's very difficult for others to understand your lived experience. And even within the preemie community, there are so many different experiences within that. And so, to speak to your question, it was very challenging for others to really empathize, because one thing is that most people would assume that once you bring the baby home, for example, um, everything is fine. And so you have, a full term baby and you can go on with life as per normal, like any other parent bringing your baby home. And that's not the case. And so I think for some people, it may be to introduce them to what it's like to be a preemie parent. And what I mean by that is, did you know that there are specific diapers that I have to buy, or specific clothing, or things that, I need to do that's different? So sometimes it's about educating them. And so that can help to restore those relationships that may be strained, but also, come and see what a day in my life looks like. And so for me, for example, my mom came at one of the visits and, saw her grandson in the incubator, and it was just a shock. Like, I didn't realize he was that little. I had friends come and I didn't realize, like, I did not know. And so sometimes those visits can really pivot, if you will, people's ideology and what they think, premature birth looks like, and what that entails. I think they have it in their mind that this is what it is, but until they see it for themselves, it's a completely different scenario. It's a completely different thing. And so sometimes you do have to invite, and I understand what you're saying about it being very personal, very intimate. However, there are people I would hope that you trust to invite them in order to be able to support you, because the support is really critical in your baby's ability to thrive and to do well, and for you to be able to feel like you are in a position to continue the journey, because it doesn't end after you leave the hospital. So you'll need to make those connections.
We do have a question from Sophie who's watching. Oh, it's not going to all show up maybe, but she said, I understand that this book is about your grief, highlighting your journey through your loss on birth, but can you briefly touch on how your book may be able to help others through? Oh, sorry. She continues here, through grieving the loss of a family member, not necessarily a child.
What a great question.
It is a great question.
It is. I feel like this book can help others who have experienced a different type of loss, because I feel like the grieving process is universal. We go through different stages of grief. Sometimes it could look like, anger, bitterness, resentment, and all of these things, disappointment, as I mentioned earlier. And so, as I mentioned, it is universal and can apply to many different family members, relatives, close friends, colleagues. And so, this book talks about ways in which you can navigate grief, not only in pregnancy loss. So, you can see that you can relate to others who are grieving whatever the circumstance of their grief may be. And so I think in any circumstance of your grief, we all should be empathetic, and we can all um, foster a more communal way of helping and supporting those who are going through grief. And this book will help others who are going through a similar situation in any circumstance. So thank you for that question.
Maureen, is your grief journey over?
I don't think it'll ever be over. I think it will stay with me until my dying day. And I say that because grief, as I mentioned in my book, is a long arc, and it can take a lifetime, because I think we who are grieving, we oftentimes don't understand what our triggers are, or what will um, have the grief come up into our present experience, because that's the way grief is. Grief takes on a personality of its own, if you will, because it is something that I don't think can ever be finished. So just realizing that this is a chapter, but a new chapter can begin, and the grief will follow you even in the next chapter. And so it's not something that I look to in the future as being finished or being over. I think it will always be there, because my son is always here with me. And so, and even with my children, it is part of their history, it's part of their legacy. And so the grief will be a part of who we are, which is why I called it a story, because that story will be passed on from generation to generation. And so, yeah.
We have another question here of what inspired you to write a book?
Great. Thank you for that question. I actually didn't go in with the mindset of writing a book. That was not my goal. I was journaling and wanting to just write my thoughts and my ideas down, thinking this would be great to go back to someday, and to really just look at how far I'd come and where I am now. But the reason it turned into a book was because I really felt compelled. I felt a real nudge to put it out there for others to read. Because as I mentioned earlier, I felt like there was a need for a book of this specific story. I needed to also help others who were going through something similar, or have had a grief of some sort or a loss. I felt like this book was needed. I felt like I had to be the one to write it. And so that's why I wrote it. I felt like there was a need that I needed to fill.
So many people journal their journeys through NICU, and there's details that we forget. I know that when I look through things from Tessa's journey, I'm like, oh, right. It was such a major thing that happened while we were there, but it's almost like it feels like a different life because we're separated from it. And so when you were writing this book and going through that process, how was that for you? did it take a toll on you emotionally to revisit in such an intimate way?
What happened was I didn't want to write this story. I didn't want to write it because of that exact reason. I didn't want to write it because I knew that it was painful. I knew it was traumatic. I knew that there was so much pain in the story, and I didn't want to go there. I had left that in the past. And so to speak to that, I had to bolster a lot of strength to go to those places that I wanted to leave behind. There was a part of me that needed to revisit it as much as I didn't want to, in order to, as I mentioned, to further heal. I needed to acknowledge that this was my story. It is a part of who I am, and I had to accept it. And so I wanted to go through the painful uh, parts in a way that I could accept that this is who I am. And the reason I say that is because I forgot, like you said, I forgot how much pain I had gone through. I had numbed a lot of the pain.
Mhm.
I needed to open up some of those wounds in order to fully heal and not just put a band-aid over it. And so this is why I had to go back and to deal with some of those band-aids that I had put on.
How have family and friends reacted to your book? Did they know those details of your journey, or are they learning things about you by reading? Like, once you put it out there into the world, anybody can read it, right? So are you finding people who you know are approaching you to talk about it and open up these discussions?
Yes, obviously I had shared a lot of the details of my story with friends, close relatives, but until you actually write it down, there's just a lot of details that they themselves had forgotten, or because those emotions are ours. Those are the things that we own. But for other people, they may not own those things. And so they realized that there was a lot of emotion behind the story. There were gaps that I was filling in with my story that people hadn't heard. And so the book itself really chronicles a lot of the the details that were missing when I was, articulating the story, when I was conversing and trying to tell them what I was going through. And sometimes when you're actually going through the process, you're not telling people all of the details. You're just living it,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're living it. You're in the moment.
Yeah.
It becomes all consuming because that is where you are. And so until you write your story, I don't think people really can see the full scope or the full picture of what it is or what you had been dealing with or going through.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that comes up all the time when I visit with NICU families, and that I experienced myself, is I always say that mom guilt is real. It's something that is out there in the world, whether we want it or not. But it seems like NICU mom guilt is like an amplified version of that. Is that something that you experienced?
I don't think that there's any mother, NICU mother, who hasn't experienced it. I think it comes with the territory. It comes with having a baby in the NICU. And yes, indeed, 100% I experienced the guilt. I experienced the guilt in many ways. One of the ways, for example, is if I missed an important um, uh, for example, feeding, or if I missed the opportunity to change his diaper, or I missed an opportunity to speak with the social worker about the specific care that I wanted, or any of those details. I felt guilty if I was not there 24 hours a day, which was impossible, an expectation that was not possible. But for me, I felt like I had to be there 24 hours a day, even though that was not realistic. And so, yes, and I'm sure that's part of it too, is that we want to be able to be there 24 hours a day. And because we can't, there is that guilt, or feeling helpless, wanting to be more proactive or more active or more engaged in the care of your preemie baby, and not being able to do more than you were allowed to. You feel guilty.
Tell me about your life now. I'm thinking for people who are in it right now, are in that space of grief, who are in NICU right now. It can be hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and we all remember that space. And so, tell us what your life looks like now.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I have two boys. My oldest recently turned 9, and my youngest, my preemie, is now 6.
Wow.
It's hard to believe. And so my life now is that I am eternally grateful for their health. I am so thankful that my preemie is thriving. He is surpassing his milestones. He is trying to keep up with his big brother. Our house is full of happiness and joy now. And so, although there was guilt, there was sorrow. So, for anyone who is grieving or is in the thick of the NICU, and what that looks like, I wish I had known that I was going to be okay, and that my baby was going to be okay. I didn't know that. I worried at every juncture. Um, but we are an active family now. We are a family that does life together, knowing how far we've come. And so we celebrate those victories every day as much as we can. We try to remember just how far we've come in our challenges and things that we've overcome. And so we are a family that's very thankful, grateful for each day, each blessing that we have.
Mm. I'm going to ask you one more question, and that is, what would you like to say to those who are watching and listening? What advice do you have for them as we close out today?
My advice would be to take it one step at a time. It could be very overwhelming as a preemie parent, and there's a lot being thrown at you, is to really just take it one step at a time. And what I mean is to try to digest the information, but also to realize that it is going to be tough. It's going to be difficult, but to also celebrate those little victories is also important. So if your baby is feeding well or has gained a little bit of weight, I know that when that happened for my son, it just allowed me to relax.
Mm.
It allowed me to relax even for that moment. And so I think that's really important, to celebrate the little victories and to realize how far your baby has come is important. To be mindful of your own mental health and your self-care, to take the time to even step away for a little while, go for a walk. I always found that really helpful, um, because it could be overwhelming, and you are trying to do everything that you possibly can to help your baby to thrive. But the one thing that, and I believe it was a social worker who told me, is that you are the only one who can do what you can do. And to be able to do that, you need to look after yourself. And so where there is guilt, there also is strength. And that strength comes from being able to just take some time for yourself and to recharge, is really important. And to be able to just to breathe, remember to breathe, that it is difficult, the worry, the challenges that may be thrown at you, things that are unexpected that happen, because that is part of it as well. There are a lot of unexpected things that happened in my journey with my preemie. But to take it in some way in stride, knowing that you have your child in the best care, there are people who are rooting for them, and to be mindful of your own health is really important. So those are the things that I would say, and to truly advocate for the best care. If there is someone who isn't looking after your baby the way that you want, you have every right to speak to the social worker and say, I would prefer that this person look after my baby, and to really advocate for your baby. I had to do that on a number of occasions, to really advocate, excuse me, for the care that I wanted. I know that can be intimidating, but at the end of it, it is all about your baby, and getting them to the healthiest, the strongest, that they can be.
I'm so glad that you said that, because often we as parents, I mean, it's so disorienting to be in NICU, right? So you almost need permission to be able to speak up for your child, something that later on in life, like in the school system, we kind of learn how to do. But NICU parents are thrown into that of, you have to start advocating right away.
Absolutely. Don't be afraid. You have the permission. I give it to you. You have permission. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your story with us on Preemie Chats, but also for writing it and for making it available for families.
Thank you for having me. This was a wonderful pleasure. Thank you so much.
And for everyone watching, thank you for joining us. The video of today's session and all of these video series are available on the CPBF website, which is canadianpreemies.org. CPBF is a charitable organization, and it believes that through education and support, families will be empowered and ready to care for their baby. Visit their website and consider making a donation. Together, we can create a better and brighter future for all of our families. We hope to see you again. We're going to be back next Friday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, with special guest Mary Lee Brockway, who's going to be talking about breastfeeding, self-efficacy in the preterm population, clinical considerations for enhancing parental confidence in breastfeeding. I hope you will be able to join us. See you then.